I'm Ritika Biswas, the curator of 9 Nodes of Non-Being here at 421 in Abu Dhabi. 9 Nodes of Non-Being is an exhibition, a group exhibition of 9 artists, each of whom occupies a very particular node, hence why the title comes from, that parses and illuminates and unravels the very entangled questions around human extinction, specifically related to the climate, but also its sort of related geopolitical upheaval. How do we represent the unrepresentable? How do we represent the absence, the loss, the incommensurable idea of not existing at all? And this is where the idea of non-being comes into play. How do we look at non-being as not simply a negative void, a negative of the real or the opposite of real or of the true, but instead as a generative space? And by generative, I don't mean necessarily a positive space, but rather the space between the possible and the real, and how that unfolds into a space of imagination, but also of deep critical thinking, of considering and of encountering this very entangled question of extinction itself. We have several different artists who are represented in this exhibition, coming from the MENA region, Southeast and Southeast Asia, as well as Latin America. So I'm going to take you through the exhibition now. So now we're in UNMAKE LAB's node. UNMAKE LAB is a duo from South Korea comprising Bin Na-choi and Suyeon Song. And this work is called Ecology for Non-Futures, which is an ongoing project that UNMAKE LAB has been doing for the last several years. And this is a new iteration. This space, we've made it look like basically an old grandma's kitschy living room in a way, because we want people to come in and feel familiar with the space and to feel a sense of coziness and comfort before things start unraveling and people start noticing the strangeness of the space. The wallpaper itself, which looks kind of like chintz, but is actually these strange creatures that have been used to create this pattern or design, or these prints behind us where it looks like these real creatures who've been framed almost like family members who've passed away in a way, referring to the idea of these non-beings and non-futures that have either never existed or will not exist in the face of climate extinction. A lot of these non-beings that you see look like real animals, but they've in fact been generated by artificial intelligence and generative neural networks, collating different imagery that UNMAKE LAB has been collecting over the years from wildfire-affected regions and camera-trapped trail cam footage, as well as colonial taxidermy animals and a variety of different sources. So we have a video here called Ecology for Non-Futures, as well as these wood pieces, which are the barks that UNMAKE LAB has collected from these wildfire-affected regions and imprinted them with words that have been generated from prompts to AI, asking them what they think about non-futures or extinction, or the language of futurity. And so we kind of see this untethering of meaning and language in the face of all of the non-futures that we are currently undergoing, because extinction here, we're not looking at it simply as a geographical or scientific fact, but we're looking at it as a philosophical crisis in many senses, a space where we cannot contend with our own extinction, our own collective non-being. And so UNMAKE LAB gives us a way to approach that with humor and kitsch and silliness and strangeness, which is why they are part of this exhibition. Now we're here with the works of Amba Sayal-Bennett, who is an artist based in London. Amba's is a really interesting piece of work because she works a lot with colonial histories of modernism and of the ornament, but does so through her mainly sculptural and projection works that contends with the idea of communing with otherness, not through identification or processes of empathy, but rather through abstraction and through considering the performative geometries of the line and of various ornamental motifs and structures that sort of overflow their parameters. So a lot of Amba's works for this exhibition are about how the motif of the ornament overflows the sort of linear logic and the parameters of the clean lines of modernism. And a lot of this is being drawn from her maternal ancestral city, which is Chandigarh, which was commissioned by the first Prime Minister of India, of independent India, Jawaharlal Nehru, who had commissioned Le Corbusier to basically create this very futuristic, future-thinking city that cuts away very cleanly from the deep pain and bloodshed of the partition and the post-partition strife in South Asia, which caused the partition of India and Pakistan. And so a lot of Amba's thinking around this is about the way that we have this motif of the flower or of the botanical form or of the ornament in general, which is us seeing also nature as monstrous, as a monstrous excess that overflows the parameters of anthropocentric urbanism, right? So that's kind of where her work over here draws from. So we're here now in Zara Mahmood's node, and Zara is a Pakistani artist based in Dubai, and her work is also quite entangled within ideas of abstraction and of quietness and of solitude. A lot of her work is about thinking through time and noise and silence, as well as aloneness, and the different ways in which light can be traced across our domestic, public, as well as private spheres of thought and existence. So over here we have a work called Listen, which is being hung and kind of left to its own devices. Zara's work is a lot to do with materiality and about how different, how her work changes and refracts across different materialities. So for example, in Dimension 3, you'll see that she has used photo transfer to print images onto and transfer images onto ceramic. And she's very curious about what that does to the image itself and the feeling of the image, the materiality and the texture of an image. We're here with Fayçal Baghriche's A Souvenir, which is this luminous globe spinning on this axis quite fast, so you can't actually discern any of the continents and the words that we associate with these land masses or even these oceanic boundaries anymore. The reason I think Fayçal's work is incredibly important is because we very rarely think about the loss of the whole and our place in this totality, as we never really conceive of the planetary whole in our day-to-day sort of lives and our meanderings, right? And so I think with this luminous globe, we're allowed the space of meditation, of reflection, of this encounter with the loss of the potential whole, the extinction of the world and the planet as we know it, in a way that is not simply an aesthetic or a poetic meditation, but also a deeply geopolitical one. Because this work also forces us to think about the ways in which there are stratifications of power across the globe in terms of geopolitics, in terms of migration, in terms of how the Anthropocene is a stratified phenomenon. It is an event that is already unfolding across the world. It is not a futurity. It is something that is already taking place, especially among communities who are the most vulnerable to it. And this arises because of the different stratifications of power across the globe as we know it. The Keepers is part of Ayman Zedani's ongoing project where he's been researching these parasitic plants found in the Arabian desert across the region. So he's been looking into how we can potentially look at DNA as a future data storage solution. So for this exhibition, you can see that Zedani's works have kind of taken it a step further into becoming these parasitic chimeral plants that have also absorbed the DNA and the histories of the human as well as the different non-human species in the desert. So you can kind of see these almost face-like creatures with the eyes and the mouth, where we're kind of imagining the future human as phytomorphic and no longer in the form that we currently inhabit, in a way to think about not simply through speculative sort of sci-fi future fantasies, but to actually sit down and have a sort of contention with what it is that the future of humanity itself may and can look like. Here we are in Mariam AlZayani's work. It's called Post-Anthroparty, and this is the largest commission for 9 nodes of non-being in this year. So for this exhibition, Mariam is not simply an artist, she takes on this role of a party planner. She's planning a party for the end of humanity and civilization as we know it, and this is called Post-Anthroparty because we're essentially walking through this sonic and object graveyard, post-human extinction, in a very strange, absurd, surreal, also hyper-real at the same time, sort of kitschy and uncanny space. So we're essentially in this party for not simply human extinction, but also to think about the ways in which all of these objects that we've created for our own use, for anthropocentric use, they've kind of lost their entire value, and how they're decaying in the aftermath of human existence and human extinction. So we have these clocks that are kind of running backwards. We have, and running out of like linear capitalist time, for example. So a lot of this installation kind of plays with multiple registers of excessive sort of emotion. It plays with pathos and melancholy, but also of humor and stupidity and silliness, in a way that I think helps us to contend with the deeply overwhelming knowledge of our own extinction in ways that are not simply lighter, but also allow us new pathways into reckoning with the realities of our own extinction. For example, over here you have these plastic chairs that have melted, and plastic is particularly a concoction that was made by humans for human use. What is happening to these chairs and all of this plastic after we leave? Or what is happening to neon as as a constructed material, as a human constructed material? What is happening to capitalist linear time in this wall of clocks where all of the time is glitching? It's running backwards, it's running slower, it's not running at all in ways that we have come to understand it. Here we have a TV which is playing sort of the rolling credits of humanity itself, where you have Finn kind of like rolling on loop in this way that also harkens to the ways in which we create images and narratives, I guess, for the human in order to elevate our own existence and elevate our own importance in the scheme of the world. So in the second room, you kind of walk through the living room into this dining room where you see this sort of banquet laid out in a way that you might find at a party or at a dinner party of sorts. And you can see how Mariam has kind of made these plates in a way that it looks like fungi has sort of started growing and rotting and molding, where the food itself has become fused to the plate in all of these different non-human colonies and these sort of fungal colonies. But then you have these plastic fruits that you often have decorating a dinner party table that remain in the aftermath of human extinction. But a lot of this room is also about the way that we commodify nature in these different object relations, sort of relating to the human, right? So you have these very strange kitschy posters that say things like concise plant art, or these funny sayings saying years meet the best time, or scenery, right? And so it thinks about the ways in which we've constructed this set of power and object relations between us and non-human nature in a way that not simply commodifies it, but also estranges it and creates a very particular aesthetic and political lexicon around her work and her practice. We're here with Malik Irtiza's works. Her works are specifically situated within the schisms and the voids of meaning making of contested and violent histories, especially in sites like Kashmir. So this series of works called Whispers from the Void basically follows the trajectory of this shadowy non-being creature called Shok Basin, which is a character from the different stories that the artist's mother used to tell her as a child. And so we see these clusters that she's created of these tongue sculptures, which are these corporeal traces of Shok Basin that also signify this untethering of body and language and meaning from one another. The soundscape comprises of this very eerie lullaby that is sort of humming as we walk through the entire exhibition of 421, combined with these sounds that she has sort of layered along this lullaby, which ranges from firecrackers celebrating festivals or birthdays or joy in some sense, to helicopter sounds and gunfire and shots. So altogether, she's kind of putting together this ritualistic chanting, which are different from one another, but also how do we make sense or make any logic when the signifiers of a particular sound have been sort of ripped apart from what we associate them with, when we don't know whether a sound is that of celebration or of immense violence and grief and loss, of annihilation, essentially, right? What do we do in the space and the void of obliteration itself? So these clusters are basically where Shok Basin, this sort of shadowy non-being, has been traversing through 421 and has sat within this skeletal boat, or has, climbed these trees or the walls or the nooks and crannies. So you have these clusters of the tongue, soundscape, and the text kind of coming together as these node-like clusters or these sub-nodes across this exhibition that has been specifically commissioned for 9 Nodes of Non-Being and continues on from Irtiza's existing work. Here in the central courtyard of 421, we have Vapor by seminal film director Apichatpong Weerasethakul, who's based in the village of Tunga in Thailand for the last 15 years. This film is actually based in Tunga, where the premise is quite simple. There's a white vapory haze, this toxic haze that descends upon the village and engulfs the entire village. And the people are trying to move through their days, their mundane lives, and perform their activities. Vapor not only speaks to the way that this village is plagued by land management sort of issues, the capitalist politics of smog that engulfs northern Thailand annually. For me, the reason I included this film within 9 Nodes of Non-Being is that it allows us to think about the ways in which we normalize the apocalypse, the ways in which we have to continue living at this very slippery edge of extinction, even as we are undergoing and in the midst of this toxic event of the climate apocalypse, and also to think about vulnerable communities who are already undergoing extinction in a way that may not affect the most privileged strata of society yet. So here at 421, we've also installed these fog and vapor machines that engulf the actual physical space of the courtyard in something that feels like a similar vapor to the one that you see in the film, to allow people to become more spectral, to play in the space of non-being and to exist in the space of negation in a way that they otherwise may not be able to. And it also interacts with the ideas and the fumes of toxicity and this almost etheric substance, which is not just metaphor, but also an actual materiality or a demateriality of non-being. This is Treno by Colombian artist Clemencia Echeverri. As you can see, we have a double projection on either side of the facades to the entrance of 421. So Treno basically references a trenodia, which is a sorrowful lamentation, a song of mourning, essentially. And what we're seeing are two video projections of the river Cauca, which has long been a site for people who've been forcibly disappeared in Colombia. And so instead of showing these bodies, because they've often been disappeared and forcibly so, we often just see the river itself flowing through us. We see fragments of a shoe or a shirt, and we hear people calling out for their loved ones whom they have lost in these rivers. Treno constructs a deeply powerful and important, I think, space of lamentation, of mourning the unmournable. How do you mourn something which has either not yet happened or is invisible and we are currently undergoing it, but we do not know that we are in the midst of it? And for me, this is where it extends into climate-related apocalypse as well as geopolitical apocalypse of opposing regimes, necropolitical regimes, of fascism, of ecological violence, and those who are the most deeply affected by it. The Anthropocene is not a monolith; it is stratified, and those who are most deeply affected by it are those who are at the mercy of these necropolitical regimes of power, as we see in Treno. Each of these 9 nodes of non-being unfolds for us this deep paradox that we find ourselves within, this paradox of a muchness and of a blankness. Muchness in terms of the data, the insurmountable evidence that we have of climate-related apocalypse and extinction, but also a blankness, our inability to really contend philosophically and existentially with this anomalous space that we find ourselves collectively and deeply personally within. And so through 9 nodes of non-being, what I really wanted to do was to address this paradox, but through unexpected portals and affective registers of excess, these excessive modes of rest and cringe and kitsch and bathos and melancholy. And maybe we can begin to unlearn and unsee the climate apocalypse in ways that we are so used to that we stop really seeing them or conceiving of it as such. And that can help untether our conceptions of the climate apocalypse in ways that are generative. And this is why, for me, negation and non-being was this generative expanse, to think through a collective and individual non-being altogether.